In our second video for C4.1, we're going to focus pretty much exclusively on communities and the interactions between different organisms and specifically different populations within the same area. And that's what defines a community, are different populations that occupy the same geographic location. And so that's what we'll focus on in C4.1 Part 2. So a community is a group of populations that live together in the same geographic area, and they interact with one another in that same area. It could be hundreds to thousands of different species. Coral reefs, rainforests, savanna are all good examples. And so in this video, we'll look at how do those interactions take place and what types of interactions exist between those different populations. The first types of interactions that we'll define and outline are actually interactions between members of the same population, and we refer to these as intraspecific relationships. And so these are relationships between individuals of the same species, usually within the same population, and they generally focus on one of two different things: competition and cooperation. And so for competition, members of the population are the same species and they occupy the same niche in the same location. And so unless the resources are just extremely abundant, there's going to be some sort of competition for those resources. There will be competition that exists. And so due to variation, some individuals will be more successful at acquiring those resources than others and have a higher chance of being able to survive and reproduce. And in terms of natural selection, we refer to this as fitness. Those organisms, those individuals will have higher fitness. This results in natural selection over generations, where we can see that population change over time. Some good examples would be competition for light within plants, food within animals, breeding sites within different types of animals. Birds, for example, is a good example of that. Pollinators and flowering plants. There's lots of different examples of competition because resources are generally limited. On the other hand, there's also examples of cooperation, in which there's a cooperation between the individuals within a population. We see this less so amongst plants and more so in social animals. The advantage of cooperation in comparison to competition is that all of the individuals benefit. It has some benefits for all of them. And so some good examples would be like huddling of birds or mammals to be able to save heat using the body warmth, schooling of fish out in the open ocean in tight balls to be able to avoid predation, hunting in groups like wolves, sharing of parental care we sometimes see in birds. And so those are all good examples of cooperation between members of the same species so that they all benefit. Obviously, then, interactions exist between members of different species, different populations, and we refer to these as interspecific relationships, in which there are interactions between different species that are within the same community. And there's quite a few different examples of this. The first would be herbivory. Herbivores, primary consumers, are feeding on a producer that may or may not kill them. For example, grazing animals, different insects feeding on phloem sap, limpets feeding on algae. Basically, some sort of first level consumer consuming a producer. Predation is a second example, and this is in which one consumer kills and eats another, and this would be represented by a predator-prey dynamic. Anteaters eating ants, lions eating a variety of different grazing animals, starfish eating oysters are all good examples, and I'm sure you can think of other ones as well. Interspecific competition also exists between different species, and this is competition for the same resource by two or more species. And so a good example of this would be ivy climbing oak trees and competing for light. We have a lot of that in the Pacific Northwest. If you go out, you can see ivy climbing up trees, trying to get lights. Woodpeckers and squirrels for nesting sites. Bottlenose dolphins and sharks for food sources. Those all represent competition between different species. Mutualism is also an example, and this is in which there's two species living in close association with one another, in which they both benefit. And some examples we'll see actually discussed in our next section of this video. Parasitism is a further example, and this is in which one species lives in or on or around another, and it obtains food or nutrients from the host, thereby harming the host. And so a good example of this would be like a tick feeding on a deer, the blood from the deer, some types of daughter plants growing on a plant host and absorbing foods from them, The lamprey in the Pacific Northwest is also a good example by extracting resources from its host fish. In general, parasites would represent this. And then a final example would be pathogens, in which one species, the pathogen, lives inside another, the host, and causes some sort of disease. Some good examples of this would be the potato blight fungus that caused the potato famine. Years ago, tuberculosis bacterium infecting badgers, as well as the measles virus. So these are going to be diseases that cause problems or harm the host. And so this is also a good example of interspecific relationships. Returning to mutualism, these are examples in which both species benefit from the relationship, and those interactions are often taking place between different taxonomic kingdoms. The root nodules in Fabaceae and Ribosium bacteria are a good example of this. The plants, the Fabaceae are legumes, like beans, and the plants in this case they require nitrogen to be able to produce amino acids and different nitrogen compounds that they need in order to be able to survive and grow. And although the atmosphere has lots of nitrogen in it, about 78%, plants can't take in nitrogen from the atmosphere. They have to get it from the soil in the form of ammonium or nitrate. And it's often a limiting factor within ecosystems because plants need it. And so the mutualistic relationship is developed between the bacterium and some plants that the bacteria provide the nitrogen that the plant needs. It's able to absorb that nitrogen from the air and fix it and convert it into a form that's usable by the plant. The plant provides root nodules for the bacterium to be able to live, and it also helps to maintain a low oxygen level in those nodules that's desired by the bacteria, and it also supplies sugar to the bacteria. So the plants are getting the nitrogen, the bacteria are getting an environment that they like to be able to live in, and so they are both benefiting. Our second example is somewhat similar, in which Mycorrhizal, which is a type of root fungus, has a mutualistic relationship with orchid plants. The orchid is providing and supplying sugars to the fungus, where the fungus also provides nitrogen and phosphorus from the soil to the orchid, provides carbon and organic compounds from digested dead organic material, and it supplies water absorbed from the soil to the plant. So both benefiting, similar to the nitrogen-fixing bacteria that we saw as well. And our third example that we previously discussed in other sections of the course is zooxanthellae, which is found in hard corals. The coral provides a safe environment, a reliable light source, because it grows close to the surface, and can also provide carbon dioxide to the zooxanthellae, in which they are providing glucose and amino acids through photosynthesis and oxygen to the coral. So both of those are benefiting, and in times when we see coral bleach or turn white, it's because the zooxanthellae has left or been removed from the coral, and that causes them to turn white, and eventually those coral will die if the zooxanthellae bacteria do not return. Another type of interaction that we see between species are those of endemic species and invasive species. And a species that is endemic means that it's naturally occurring in that particular area, sometimes also referred to as a native species. And an invasive or alien species is one that's introduced, whether that be deliberately or accidentally, typically by humans, to a particular area. It's not traditionally found from there. And so density-dependent factors that we previously discussed typically regulate endemic species, whereas invasive species are not necessarily regulated by these density-dependent factors because they lack pests or predators that would naturally control them in that new introduced area. And so invasive species then can increase and spread very quickly and rapidly as a result. In the Pacific Northwest, Himalayan blackberry is a very common and quickly spreading invasive non-native species. Because two species cannot occupy the same ecological niche at the same time indefinitely, one is eventually going to outcompete the other. An alien species become invasive by outcompeting the endemic species that results in a smaller realized niche or loss of it completely for that native endemic species. And this occurs frequently because we as humans accidentally transport species from their native area to a new area that they're not typically found in. A good example of this that we discussed in the first video of this section were the lionfish. Sylvania is a second example, and this is a floating fern that's endemic to southeastern Brazil, and it's grown around the world in aquariums and ornamental ponds. It's escaped, shockingly, and it can double in population size through asexual reproduction in a couple of days, so it reproduces super quickly, and it can completely cover lakes and rivers, thereby blocking sunlight from the endemic plants and other species that live there, so it outcompetes for the resource of light with those native species, thereby causing those other native species to eventually perish. The testing for two species being present together and being associated with one another can be conducted to determine if competition exclusion exists or if it's a mutualistic relationship. And we can do this then by looking at the interspecific competition relationships. And there's essentially two different possibilities. One, that the two species are distributed independently, meaning that they're not associated with one another, and this represents our null hypothesis. The second is that the two species are associated with one another, and this represents our alternative hypothesis. And so we can test these hypotheses using a chi-squared test to examine and see if there's a relationship between the two species, an association. Quadrant sampling, previously discussed, is taken randomly, and there needs to be at least 5 countings or more to be able to successfully use this test. The rejection of the null hypothesis, if we find that, indicating that they are independently distributed, it's not proof of competition because the species could have different habitat requirements. They don't necessarily occur together, or they could occur together more frequently than expected due to the same habitat requirements, but they're not limited by resource competition. And so, although it's not evidence or complete proof of competition, it can indicate that there is some. It can also be strengthened by the removal of one species in the field and then testing for the increase in the other. Because if one's removed and the other increases, then that would indicate that there's competition between them. Or within the lab, doing a lab experiment by growing of the species together and apart to see how the population sizes increases in the lab specifically. The actual conduction and using of a chi-square test is, again, the purpose for testing for the independence or association as a goodness of fit test between the two different species to see if competition exists. How this process is actually conducted, we're going to practice within my class, or there's lots of other really good videos that explain how to carry out the steps and actually do this test. It does require a contingency table, and so having some practice with performing chi-square test is recommended. It oftentimes shows up on the overall exam, so consult one of those other videos in order to identify the steps and have some practice. Another type of interaction between different populations that's very common and you're probably familiar with is called a predator-prey interaction or relationship. And this is the result of the removal of the prey from the population by a predator, but it generally doesn't completely decline the prey population or wipe out the prey population because they're born at about the same rate as what they're lost, assuming that there's a balance within the population. And so the predator eats the prey, but there's a maintained balance within that population. The predator population remains stable through equal birth and death rates, as well as just the food availability. So the predator population size remains somewhat consistent. There can be instances where the predator and the prey balance goes through kind of some cyclical oscillations in which there is an increase in the prey, results in increased predator food. The rise in predators then increases the rate of predation, so the prey numbers fall. Because there's a prey decrease, it creates less food for the predator, so the predator population declines. But then because of the predator declining, it increases the prey numbers. And so it kind of follows this cyclical pattern where it's up, down in terms of population size for both predator and prey, where the predator numbers are varying somewhat similar in up and down amounts, just following the prey or slightly delayed in the prey population changes. And we've seen these patterns by tracking population sizes in lots of different populations. A good example would be in Sweden between fox and hare populations in the 1960s to the 1980s. The oscillation occurred in predator population size, showing that it was dependent on the prey population. The lynx and hare from the mid-1800s to early 1900s also shows a similar pattern, as we can see in some of the graphs. And so these cyclical oscillations in predator and prey interactions are observed in habitats with varying weather conditions. A warmer summer will result in more plant growth, thereby increasing the food for the herbivores, so their numbers rise, triggering an increase in predator population the following year, and thereby kicking off this cycle. And so predator and prey always have these interactions where the predator population is dependent on the prey population. Usually it balances out unless there's some change in the environments, like we see here with this example of a warmer summer resulting in more plant growth. That then can kick off this continual change in the predator-prey dynamics and population sizes. Population control, in terms of its overall size, is managed by interactions between different trophic levels within a food chain. So a food chain being essentially what eats what within the environment, and a trophic level is the level that the organism exists within that food chain, within the interactions within the ecosystem. And we display these linearly. If you combine multiple food chains, then that produces a food web. Predator and prey are direct interactions where, as we just discussed, the size of the predator population is going to depend on the prey population. And indirect then would be the effect of the decrease on the prey population, thereby then affecting the herbivore population that it feeds on. So there can be both direct and indirect means of population control. And in general, population control can take place in one of two different ways: top down or bottom up. Top down is in which there's acts from a higher trophic level to a lower trophic level. So an increase in predator numbers will decrease the prey in a lower trophic level. The opposite then is the bottom up, in which the interactions from a lower trophic level affect the higher trophic level. For example, a population of producers is limited by the availability of mineral nutrients in the soil and water. And so if those producers are limited, it's going to have effects on the following trophic levels. So that would be a bottom-up example. Our last topic then looks at some ways that organisms can defend themselves for resources, some ways that they can ensure that they get resources that are needed. Many living organisms use the same metabolic pathways for cell growth, and the product of these pathways are called metabolites. Secondary metabolites are products that are produced by only some taxonomic groups, and they generally have a wide range of other functions that are not necessarily tied to essential cell growth. And two examples of this can be those that are released into the environment and then are sometimes toxic to other organisms. Antibiotics is a great example, and it's secreted by microorganisms to kill or prevent the growth of others. And allelopathic are other substances, metabolites that are secreted into the soil by plants to deter neighboring plant growth, basically to keep some space around them. And so a good example that we can see is Antibiotics by Penicillium. This is a genus of saprotrophic fungi that inhabit soil, can also occur on fruit, bread, cheese. And so they secrete enzymes into the environment that digest the carbohydrates and proteins and other compounds, and then absorb the digested materials, the sugars, the amino acids, and other compounds. That's their nutrition. Other organisms then may potentially compete for that externally digested food. So there's, in order to reduce competition and make sure that the penicillium actually gets what it's digested externally, it secretes penicillin, the antibiotics penicillin, that then interferes with the linking of peptidoglycan molecules in cell walls of gram-positive bacteria, and it causes those bacterium to become weak, the cell walls to become weak, and they burst and they die. And so essentially it's a defense mechanism to make sure that the penicillium gets what's it's digested. We then obviously have been able to take advantage of that and use penicillin as a type of antibiotic that helps us to treat some different diseases. The organism only does this when supplies of food are scarce, because it takes energy to be able to produce that penicillin. So it only does it in times of limited food availability. And our second example is allelopathy, in which different plant species will secrete metabolites that essentially block or deter other plants from growing, essentially to create space so that they have resources. The tree of heaven, which is a type of tree that's native to China, has become invasive across much of North America, and it releases chemicals to be able to do this. Also, the eastern black walnut tree releases chemicals that prohibit other plants from growing nearby. And so this would also be kind of a defense mechanism to be able to ensure that they get resources. So this then concludes our looking at populations and communities, and our second section of this unit will look at how energy is transferred between these different interactions of community members.